The late spring sun stretched long shadows over the churchyard as laughter rose in clusters across the green-trimmed lawn. Children darted around picnic blankets, and the scent of rhubarb pie, ham, and fresh-cut grass mingled on the breeze. It was the first community gathering of the season, the annual church picnic, and with it came the first dance. Everyone noticed when Lorna Bell arrived. She wore her mourning black still, though it had been nearly 2 years since her husband, Thomas, passed from fever. Not many widows stayed in black that long. Fewer still chose to live alone in the same cabin he'd built, on the quiet ridge where the old dogwood bloomed. But Lorna had stayed, and she had mourned in her way, without complaint, without fanfare. She came into town twice a month for supplies, helped tend the sick when asked, and never raised her voice. Her hands were always busy, mending, cooking, sewing for neighbors in need. But today, she had brought herself to town for something different. A start, perhaps, or at least the chance to feel less alone. She carried a basket of warm oat bread with her, wrapped in a linen embroidered with dogwood blossoms. It was placed carefully on the table near the pies, and she stood back, arms folded across her apron, trying not to draw attention. She was not young, 38, but still soft-faced, with brown hair braided back from her temples, and a figure that had grown fuller with time and grief. Her dress fit snugly across her hips and arms, but her posture remained straight, her eyes steady. If anyone had asked, Lorna would have said she came to enjoy the music, to be kind. She would not have said she hoped to be noticed. But she did. The music began, a jaunty fiddle tune played by the pastor's son, and couples began to form beneath the lanterns strung between trees. She stood near the edge, listening, watching. A man approached, Wade Carver, a rancher known for his salt and pepper beard and quick tongue. He glanced her way, a half smile on his lips, until someone nudged him, teasing, perhaps. He looked Lorna up and down. Then, loud enough for too many to hear, he chuckled and said, "Reckon I ain't ready to carry that much sorrow on my boots." A few laughed. A few looked away. No one said a word. Lorna stood still for a moment, then turned and walked toward the edge of the picnic grounds, toward the quiet where the horse wagons were parked. Her basket remained on the table. She never reclaimed it. She rode home before sundown, without a word to anyone, her hands gripping the reins hard enough to leave half-moon prints in the leather. She said nothing aloud. She only whispered to herself once, as the ridge came into view and the white dogwood tree shimmered like a veil in the dusk. I am not too much. I am not too little. I am still here. The mornings on the ridge came slowly, draped in mist. Lorna rose before first light, always. Her small kitchen filled with the scent of wood smoke and flour as she measured by memory. No need for scales, just feel. Her hands knew what dough should become. She kneaded in silence, her sleeves rolled up, her wedding band now resting in a small wooden dish on the windowsill. She never wore it anymore, but she couldn't quite tuck it away. Each day began with bread. The warmth of it was her first comfort, the rising of the dough as quiet and steady as her own heart. She delivered loaves in the early hours, wrapped in cloth and left on stoops before anyone stirred. Sometimes a note was left in return. "Thank you. Still warm. Tastes like my mother's." She never signed her name. People knew. Beyond baking, there was mending. She sewed in the light near her window, beneath the white dogwood tree Thomas had planted when they first married. It bloomed now, lavish and pale against the blue sky, a cascade of petals that fell like blessings on her doorstep. The cottage was modest, 2 rooms and a root cellar, but it stood firm. Thomas had built it from pine, hands calloused with care, and not a single board had warped in the years since he passed. It was a good house. It remembered love. People brought her things to repair. Overalls torn at the knee, a baby's blanket unraveling at the corner, a hymnal spine to glue back. She never asked for payment, but folks left eggs or a jar of preserves. or sometimes firewood. She accepted with a small nod and the same quiet dignity that defined her. Still, there were hours when loneliness lapped against the corners of her mind like cold water against rock. In those times, she walked the ridge trail or sat beneath the dogwood and read aloud to the wind. Books from Thomas's shelf, old poetry that spoke of wide skies and long sorrow. She stitched her pain into quilts, into bread, into the very folds of her curtains. Lorna did not expect company. So, when the fence post split in the back pasture and she went to town for a new one, she didn't anticipate the man who would carry it to her wagon without a word, nor that he would follow up days later to see if it had held. His name was Eli Mercer. He was a widower too, though she didn't know that then. He lived on the far side of town and worked as a carpenter mostly, quiet jobs, repairs, making shelves for the general store, or fixing porch steps for the schoolhouse. He spoke gently, if at all, and had a way of looking at things with full attention, as if even a loose nail deserved patience. The first time he visited, it was under the pretense of checking the post.
"It's a clean split," he said, kneeling beside it. "Dry rot. I'll replace it if you like."
"I can manage," Lorna replied. He nodded once, then added, "Still, I brought an extra. No charge." She watched him work. Efficient, silent, respectful. He didn't linger, didn't try to be clever, just tipped his hat when he left. The next week, a board on her porch creaked, and Eli appeared again. "I had some spare pine," he said simply. After that, it became a kind of rhythm. He would stop by with a reason, wood, a book he thought she might like, once even a jar of liniment for her aching shoulder. They didn't talk much, not at first. But sometimes he'd sit with her beneath the dogwood tree, saying nothing at all. She served tea, eventually, then a slice of bread with apple butter. It felt like setting out small lanterns in a long night. Nothing rushed, nothing promised. Lorna found she didn't dread the silence anymore, not with him. One evening, as the dogwood dropped its petals in the wind, she saw Eli pause before mounting his horse. He looked back once, nodded to her softly, and said, "You keep this place like a hymn." He left before she could answer, but she stood there a long time after, one hand on the porch rail, heart thudding like a verse remembered. The days stretched longer as spring folded into early summer. The dogwood blossoms browned and fell, replaced by the deeper greens of July. Bees droned lazily through the meadow grasses beyond the ridge, and Lorna began leaving her windows open, letting the soft wind stir the curtains and carry in the scent of wild sage. Eli kept coming, never uninvited, never expected, and yet his presence slowly grew into the folds of her life, the way moss finds its place in stone cracks, unhurried, natural. He would knock, once, maybe twice, then wait with his hat in hand. Sometimes he brought repairs, other times just conversation in the form of a well-worn book, a line of poetry, or a quiet story from his youth. One day, he brought her a volume of Whitman, pages curled from age. "This one's seen some rain," he said, holding it out. "I like books with memory," she replied, accepting it. "Like people, worn in the right places." That earned the faintest curve of a smile from Eli. Not a grin, just the kind of expression that sat gentle around the eyes. He didn't speak often, but when he did, it never felt careless. Lorna had come to respect that more than she could name. When he didn't come in person, he left notes. Sometimes folded in the fence gate, sometimes slipped beneath a stone on the porch. Not romantic, not even signed at first, just a small observation, a question about a book, or a sentence that lingered like music after the last chord. "You mentioned asters blooming. I saw some near my creek this week. Found a recipe for cornbread you might beat mine with. Do you think grief ever stops changing shape?" Lorna answered, in her own hand, with her own quiet truths. She left her replies in the crook of the old maple where he'd once leaned his coat. It became a ritual of sorts. She found herself writing at night, candlelight flickering over the page, hearing his voice in her mind. Low, careful, steady. She didn't know what to call what they were building. Friendship, perhaps. But it felt deeper than that, like something honest and undemanding, as if they were two people learning how to live again by the light of another's presence. She noticed his hands most. They were wide, browned by sun, calloused, but they moved with a gentleness she trusted. When he worked on her gate or refit a hinge on her door, he never rushed. He didn't talk as he worked, and she didn't feel the need to fill the air with words. Her silence, which had once been armor, became something else around him. A shared language, a peace. One evening, Lorna invited him to stay for supper. It was early August, the heat beginning to break. She had stewed beans and cornmeal dumplings and baked a peach cobbler that filled the house with gold warmth. Eli removed his boots before stepping in without being asked. He sat at her kitchen table like he'd done so 1,000 times before, but still careful, still respectful, like he knew he was treading on sacred ground. They ate quietly, with only the sound of cicadas beyond the open windows. When the meal was done, Lorna reached beneath the bench where she kept her sewing basket, drew out a square of fabric she had been piecing together, blue, cream, and the softest green. "It's for the church auction," she said, but her voice caught slightly. "I don't know why I care about it anymore." "You care because you make things that last," Eli replied, not looking away. She didn't answer, but something softened in her chest, that ache of being known and not flinching from it. After he left that night, she sat on the porch long after dark. The stars felt close. Her heart beat slower, like it had come into rhythm with something larger than her pain. A letter arrived 3 days later, not tucked in a gate or balanced beneath stone. It was folded carefully in an envelope, sealed with wax, her name written in script, Lorna Bell. Inside, just a few lines. "I find myself looking for your window light when I ride back from the ridge. It reminds me that not all the good in the world has gone. If you ever need another pair of hands, or eyes that see you, you have mine. E.M." She read it 3 times, then pressed it to her chest and wept, not from sorrow, but from the sudden, aching relief of being seen without being asked to change. It began with a silence too deep for dusk. The ridge had been still all day, the kind of hush that settles when the world is holding its breath. Birds quieted early. The wind went still. Lorna, pulling quilts off the line, paused and looked toward the horizon. Far off, the clouds had begun to stack, high and sharp-edged, like stone altars set against the fading sun. She lit the oil lamp before nightfall. By the time the storm arrived, it came not as a whisper, but a roar, a prairie tempest with bone-shaking thunder and sky-splitting light. Rain fell in slanting sheets. The windows rattled. Lorna moved quickly through the small house, checking latches, folding howls near the sills, placing a pot under the leak near the back door. She had weathered worse. But something in the air tonight felt different. When the wind wrenched the front shutter clean off the frame, she startled, nearly dropping the lamp. She went to the door, gripping the knob with both hands, but paused. For a moment she felt it. Not the rain, not the wind, but the sudden aching weight of being alone. Not lonely like in the quiet hours of sewing, but alone in the way a widow remembers. That no one is coming. That if something breaks, you are the only one to fix it. That if something happens, no one will know for hours, days. Her hands slipped from the door. Her breath caught. The room seemed smaller, tighter, darker. She backed away, the lamp flickering wildly on the table. Her hands trembled, and she pressed them against her chest as if to hold her ribs in place. The memory of Thomas rose without warning, his boots by the fire, his coat on the peg, his hand on her back when storms like this rolled in. She sank into the chair by the hearth, the quilt falling from her lap. Thunder cracked again, too close, and for a moment she closed her eyes, breathing shallow. The loneliness roared louder than the storm. Then, 3 knocks at the door, not frantic, just steady. She rose, heart pounding, the oil lamp casting golden rings against the wall. When she opened the door, Eli stood there, soaked through, hat in hand, coat dark with rain. His horse tied off near the fence, barely visible in the downpour. "I saw the shutter fly off from the lower ridge," he said, his voice low beneath the wind. "Didn't sit right, leaving it be." She stepped aside without a word. He entered, dripping, and placed his hat gently on the peg beside Thomas's, the one she had never moved. His eyes scanned the room like a carpenter checks a foundation, not judging, just noticing. She fetched him a towel. He took it, drying his face and hair, then knelt to the hearth and began building a fire without asking. It was the first time someone else had tended that fire since Thomas died. Lorna stood behind him, arms folded, unsure whether to help or simply witness. When the flame caught, Eli sat back on his heels and looked up at her. "You don't have to be strong all the time," he said simply. Lorna didn't respond right away. Instead, she stepped to the corner, lifted the basket of mending, and let it fall, gently, but with purpose. Threads spilled out like loosened grief. "I don't know how to be anything else," she whispered. Eli rose, standing at a careful distance. "You can be tired," he said. "You can be held." The words broke something, not loudly. There was no sob, no shattering, just a slow unraveling. Her shoulders lowered. Her breath came deeper. The space between them closed not by footsteps, but by trust. They stood in silence, the fire crackling behind them. Then Lorna stepped forward, one hand reaching up to touch the side of his arm, nothing more. "I didn't ask for this," she said. "No," he replied. "Neither did I. But I'll stand here as long as you'll let me." That night, Eli slept in the rocking chair, wrapped in an old quilt. Not because he asked, not because she needed saving, but because something had shifted. She left the door unlatched, not open, but unlatched. And when morning came and the storm had passed, the only sound was birdsong. Eli rose, folded the quilt with reverence, and set it back on the bench. Lorna watched him from the kitchen, coffee in her hand. "Fence is still standing," he said, glancing out the window. "So am I," she replied, and smiled, not out of joy, but out of recognition, of knowing someone had seen the storm and chosen to stay. August gave way to September in a slow hush. The fields turned gold, and the mornings came cooler, wrapped in fog. Lorna took to sitting on the porch swing in the early hours, a shawl around her shoulders and warm tea in her hands. The rhythm of her days remained, baking, mending, tending to the garden, but something within had quieted, not a resignation, but a settling, a soft steadiness. Eli came most afternoons now, without announcement, sometimes to fix a rail or help her patch the barn roof, but often with no reason at all beyond presence. He carved while she sewed, he read while she snapped beans. They didn't speak in every moment, but the silence between them was never empty. It was like good soil, something living could grow there. He brought her books still, and one day a carved box for her thread spools. "Figured it ought to have a home," he said, placing it on her table without fanfare. In return, she began sewing something new, a quilt, soft blues, browns, creams. Not bold like the ones she'd made before, but quiet and clean, like wind across a field. She stitched it over weeks, careful and slow. Each square came from something, an apron that had worn thin, a handkerchief from her father's drawer, a strip of one of Thomas's shirts, the collar too frayed to wear, but too beloved to discard. And she added a piece of Eli's shirt too, with a worn elbow he'd left for her to mend. When she told him what she was making, he only nodded. "Not for auction," she said, softly. He looked at the cloth draped over her lap. "No, doesn't feel like it wants to leave this place." By the time the leaves began to turn, the quilt was finished. Lorna folded it neatly and laid it on the porch swing, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. That evening, Eli arrived as he always did, dust on his boots, a fresh apple tucked in his coat pocket. He found her on the swing, the quilt between them. He didn't sit right away. He stood beside the porch rail, eyes on the horizon. "I don't have much," he said, voice low. "No land of my own, just a rented room and a pair of strong hands. But I've come to know this place, and I think, if you'd have me, I could build a life here, not to change yours, just to walk beside it." Lorna said nothing for a while. The wind moved gently through the trees, scattering dogwood leaves like faded confetti. Then she reached out and placed one hand on the quilt. "Sit," she said softly. He did. They sat that way a long time, side by side, the quilt warm over both their laps. The porch creaked now and then. A lantern glowed from the hook above. No vows were spoken, no kisses exchanged. But there was a sense of arrival, of choosing. Later, as dusk turned to deep evening, she reached over and laid her head gently against his shoulder. "You make things that last, too," she whispered. Eli didn't reply. He just placed his hand over hers, steady as earth. They stayed there long after the stars came out. The first frost came in the quiet hours before dawn. Lorna woke to the hush that only cold can bring, the kind that silvers every blade of grass, stills the wind, and presses the world into reverence. She lit the fire with practiced hands and wrapped herself in the quilt, now soft from use, its edges slightly frayed. From the porch, she watched the breath rise from the horses in the field, white clouds against a pale sky. Inside, the cottage was warm, not just from the hearth, but from the shape life had taken. 2 cups waited on the table. Eli's boots were by the door, his tools neatly stacked beneath the bench. He would be in from the barn soon, smelling of cedar and morning air. They would share breakfast in silence, as they often did. No need to fill the space between them with anything but presence. Lorna looked to the dogwood, now bare-limbed, its branches etched against the sky. Even without flowers, it stood beautiful, not for what it offered, but for what it had endured. She drew the quilt tighter and closed her eyes, letting the stillness settle. She was seen, she was safe, and she was home.